The viewport, a vast scar of hardened silica and reinforced alloys, offered me a vista no human eye had ever truly comprehended. Beyond its polished surface, the void structure bloomed a bruise on the canvas of reality. It wasn't a nebula, nor a black hole, but something else entirely. A region where the familiar rules of the cosmos seemed to fray at the edges. My breath, a shallow mist against the cool air of the observation deck, felt inadequate to the grandeur, or perhaps the profound wrongness of the spectacle before me. I, Seth, xenolinguist and psychological operations specialist, found myself a reluctant witness, yet an eager participant in this unfolding mystery. The Aethelred, our venerable research vessel, drifted with a silent, profound reverence, its engines hushed, its auxiliary thrusters making only the faintest adjustments. We were a single, fragile thought at the precipice of an unimaginable abyss. My fingers, calloused from years of tapping data slates and adjusting neural interface rigs, traced the cool glass. It was as if a tear had opened in the fabric of existence, not revealing another place, but an absence, a negation of space and time. My analytical mind, usually a fortress of logic and deduction, found itself wrestling with a concept that slipped through its grasp like smoke. My role was to understand the impact, the psychic fallout, of such a phenomenon on the human mind. Proximity readings stable, Dr. Cott gravimetric flux within expected parameters. Energy signature still. Anemic. Anemic. A curious word for something so vast, so undeniably present. It suggested a lack of vitality, a fading rather than an intense, energetic display. We had spent cycles discussing its nature, our hypotheses ranging from a nascent singularity to a pocket universe in collapse. Yet, every scan, every theoretical model, returned an unsettling blankness. I nodded, though the navigation officer couldn't see me. My eyes remained fixed on the anomaly. My initial excitement, the pure scientific curiosity that had propelled me through years of academia and countless simulations, was still a vibrant ember within me. This was the pinnacle, the true frontier. To encounter something utterly new, utterly beyond our current understanding, was the dream of every seeker of knowledge. The mission brief had been clear. Observe, record, analyze the physical properties. My secondary directive, the one whispered in hushed tones during pre-flight briefings, was to monitor the crew's psychological well-being. Subtle shifts, cognitive dissonance, the early warning signs of stress in an environment unlike any other. I was the sentinel against the unknown pressures of an alien reality. A faint hum resonated through the deck plating, the Aethelred's low thrum. It was a sound I knew intimately, the heartbeat of our metallic womb. But then, a subtle shift occurred. The hum deepened, grew ragged, like a breath catching in a throat. My internal chronometer, usually a precise instrument of self-regulation, felt momentarily dislodged. The observation deck, moments ago a pristine expanse of gray and steel, warped. Not physically, not in the way a stressed beam might buckle, but in the way a memory might become unreliable. The polished floor seemed to stretch, the bulkhead panels blurring into something less defined, more porous. Then, it solidified. The polished floor was gone, replaced by cracked, oil-stained concrete. The gleaming bulkhead panels dissolved into grimy, corrugated iron sheets, streaked with rust and the ghostly outlines of faded advertisements. The distant hum of the Aethelred systems was swallowed by a new, impossible symphony. The groaning of stressed metal, the hiss of escaping steam, the distant clang of shunting cars. The air, which had been filtered and conditioned, now carried the heavy metallic tang of industrial decay mixed with the acrid bite of coal smoke. I stood, not on the observation deck of a deep space vessel, but in a vast, echoing space under a vaulted, soot-blackened ceiling. towering skeletal gantries crisscrossed above me, their iron bones silhouetted against what should have been the eternal night of space, but was now a sickly, yellowed light filtering through high, grimy windows. Rails, thick with rust, stretched into the gloom, converging on an unseen vanishing point. Derelict freight cars, their paint peeled and faded, slumped on sidings, monuments to forgotten journeys. A railway depot. My breath hitched. My mind, usually a bastion of logic, fought to reconcile the impossible. It was too real, too vivid to be a mere hallucination. Every nerve ending screamed the truth of this place, while every neuron in my brain rebelled against it. This was not the Aethelred. This was not space. This was a memory? A dream? A sudden brutal displacement? I closed my eyes, hard, pinching the bridge of my nose. The sensory assault persisted. The distant rumble, the scent of stagnant water. I opened them again. The railway depot remained, stark and undeniable. It was warping me. And the game, it seemed, had only just begun. The void structure had always been a distant theoretical hum, a whisper in the cosmic dark. Now it swelled into a silent, vast presence, pressing against the viewport. It wasn't a maelstrom of light or a swirling nebula, but a profound absence, a wound in the tapestry of space. My designation as a xenolinguist and psychological operations specialist felt suddenly, acutely insufficient. How does one linguistically dissect a void? How does one prepare for psychological warfare waged by nothingness? Perimeter crossing in T-minus 60 seconds. The commander's voice, a practiced drone of calm, echoed through the bridge. The primary sensor display, usually a vibrant tapestry of data, now showed only a shimmering, indistinct boundary, like heat haze over an impossible desert. I leaned closer to my own console. The raw psychological feedback streams a chaotic scrawl across the screen. My task was to monitor the crew's cognitive state, to identify the first fissures in their perceptions. But who would monitor mine? A faint tremor, a resonance more felt than heard, passed through the deck plates. The Aethelred, a vessel forged for the void, responded with a barely perceptible shudder. On the main view screen, the stars, previously sharp pinpricks, began to blur at their edges, stretching like pulled taffy. Initial gravitational lensing effect, reported the navigation officer, his voice tight. Minor deviation from predicted trajectory, correcting. My own internal barometer, a finely tuned instrument of observation, registered a different kind of shift. A flicker at the edge of my vision, a momentary impression of the bridge's polished chrome bulkheads warping into something softer, organic. It was gone before I could truly grasp it. A phantom sensation. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Fatigue, I told myself, the relentless cycles of preparation finally catching up. But the sensation lingered. A faint afterimage burned onto my mind's eye. "Any anomalies, Seth?" the commander asked, turning in his command chair, his gaze sharp. "Nothing outside expected parameters, Commander," I replied, my voice steady. My fingers, however, moved with a deliberate slowness across my console, logging the brief, unquantifiable distortion. It was a data point of 1, easily dismissed, but it was mine. The view screen now presented a scene of utter, profound stillness. No stellar drift, no cosmic dust motes. Just an inky, featureless expanse that pulsed with an internal, unspoken pressure. Then it happened again. Not a flicker this time, but a complete, jarring overlay. The polished steel deck beneath my boots dissolved, replaced by grimy, oil-stained concrete. The hum of the ship's engines was drowned out by the metallic shriek of ancient brakes, the rhythmic clatter of rolling stock. The holographic star charts on the central display dissolved into a vast, rusted iron trusswork, the skeletal remains of a forgotten roof. I was no longer on the bridge of the Aethelred. I could almost feel the grit of brake dust on my tongue. the tremor of distant engines through the soles of my shoes. This was not a memory. I had never been to such a place. It was too real, too immediate, too specific to be a mere hallucination born of stress. I gripped the edge of my console, knuckles white. The ghostly image of the railway depot shimmered, then receded, like a tide pulling back from a shore. One moment, the cavernous, echoing space. The next, the familiar, sterile confines of the bridge. The transition was seamless, yet violent, leaving my mind reeling. "Status report." The commander's voice cut through the lingering echoes of train whistles. He was oblivious, his attention fixed on the navigation officer's readouts. "All systems green, Commander," the navigation officer responded, his brow furrowed with concentration. "Though our long-range comms are experiencing significant interference. It's like trying to shout through a wall of static." A colleague, the ship's primary engineer, grunted from his station. "Just sensor noise, nothing to worry about." He waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing to worry about?" I stared at the engineer, then at the navigation officer, then at the commander. Did they not see it? Did they not feel it? The railway depot had been as vivid as the ship around me. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. It wasn't just a sensor glitch. It was a breach, an invasion of the mind. "Seth, are you experiencing any unusual data spikes on your end?" the commander asked, his gaze settling on me again. There was a subtle shift in his tone, a new edge of inquiry. I hesitated, my mind racing. To report the railway depot, a hallucination so utterly out of place, so divorced from any logical context aboard a deep space vessel, would be to invite scrutiny, perhaps even removal from my post. Yet to dismiss it was to betray my very purpose. "Slight cognitive dissonance readings across the crew, Commander," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Nothing alarming. My own readings are within acceptable parameters." The lie felt like a stone in my throat. My own readings were a screaming siren. The commander nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Keep a close watch. We're in uncharted waters now." Uncharted waters indeed. I returned my gaze to the main view screen. It was watching. It was touching. The railway depot, with its rusted iron and forgotten engines, was not a random flicker of memory. It was a message, a carefully curated intrusion. And I, Seth, the specialist in understanding the incomprehensible, had just received my first terrifying transmission. The Aethelred was fully within the perimeter. It clung to the edges of my vision, a persistent afterimage behind the cold, sterile glow of the Aethelred's consoles. The void shimmered on the main view screen, no longer just a distant spectacle, but a palpable presence. An unseen hand reaching. It was touching, yes, I knew that now. Not with physical force, but with a subtle, insidious pressure on the very fabric of perception. My own. My days began to bleed into a strange cycle of observation and disquiet. The initial reports were sporadic, easily dismissed by the lead researcher as fatigue or the stress of deep space isolation. A technician, pale and twitchy, swore he saw a faint violet luminescence outlining the edges of the navigation console for a fleeting second, like static electricity, but the bridge officer, usually a bastion of stoicism, reported a persistent, low-frequency hum that no instrument could detect, a sound like a vast, distant engine idly turning over. He'd rubbed his temples, his gaze distant, as if listening to something beyond the ship's hull. I initiated formal psychological evaluations, my data pad a cool, reassuring weight in my palm. My questions were clinical, designed to probe for stress indicators, sleep deprivation, sensory overload. I meticulously logged each account, searching for patterns, for the common threads of a shared delusion or a contagious anxiety. I spoke of cognitive biases, of the brain's tendency to fill in gaps, of the unique psychological pressures of our mission. My words were a shield, for them and for me, against the encroaching irrationality. But the reports grew more frequent, more vivid. A security officer described a momentary lapse in his internal clock, a sensation of having lived the same 3 minutes twice, the exact same words exchanged with a colleague, the same clink of a coffee mug. It was like a skip in a record, he'd explained, his brow furrowed with genuine confusion. But I was the needle. I knew the song was playing again. The botanist, tending to the hydroponics bay, claimed the leaves of the synthetic flora had momentarily shivered with an unnatural internal light, like veins pulsing with something alien. She dismissed it as an optical illusion, but her hands trembled as she spoke. I tried to maintain my professional distance, my calm demeanor a bulwark against the rising tide of the inexplicable. I ran diagnostics on the ship's environmental systems, checked for subtle atmospheric changes, electromagnetic interference. Nothing. The Aethelred was a fortress of steel and science, yet something was seeping in, not through its hull, but through the delicate architecture of our minds. Then it was my turn. I was reviewing the day's logs in my small cabin, the hum of the life support systems a familiar lullaby. I scrolled through the navigator's report of phantom echoes, the engineer's complaint of a persistent metallic taste in his mouth that no amount of water could rinse away. My focus sharpened, seeking the elusive link. As I leaned back, a faint, acrid scent reached me. Oil and rust. The railway depot. It was so subtle, so fleeting, I almost dismissed it as a phantom memory, a trick of the mind. But it lingered, a ghost of an odor, just at the edge of perception, refusing to dissipate entirely. I stood, crossing to the small viewport, pressing my palm against the cool Durasteel. There was no depot, no rusted iron, no soot-choked air. Only the sterile, manufactured atmosphere of the ship. Yet the scent persisted, a faint, unsettling promise of decay. The anomaly wasn't just influencing them, it was beginning its work on me. The railway depot was not just a memory, it was a breach. They were for me too. And I was failing to find a rational explanation for the scent of rust on a starship, miles from any terrestrial decay. It felt less like a hallucination, and more like a memory trying to overwrite the present. A raw, corroded landscape seeping into the pristine, polished chrome of my existence. Did you? He was hunched over his display, fingers twitching, eyes darting around the command bridge as if tracking a phantom. I turned from my own analysis of the anomaly's perceptual influence, the data a meaningless jumble of numbers and flickering graphs that no longer seemed to correspond to anything real. Hear what, colleague? The scraping, like metal on metal, from the ventilation shafts. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. His gaze lingered on the engineering chief, who was meticulously recalibrating a sensor array, his back to us. Sounds like someone dragging something heavy. The engineering chief slowly straightened, turning with a deliberate slowness that felt pregnant with unspoken accusation. I've been here for the past 2 hours. There's nothing in the vents, navigation officer. Perhaps you're tired. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth. Or perhaps, he retorted, his voice gaining an edge. Someone wants us to be tired, wants us distracted. His eyes narrowed, fixed on the engineering chief's hands, which were now resting, unmoving, on the console. Did you touch the primary environmental controls earlier? I felt a sudden drop in pressure. The engineering chief let out a short, humorless laugh. That's absurd. I haven't left this station. The air thickened, a palpable tension coiling between them. This was precisely what my psychological operations training had prepared me for. Yet observing it firsthand, the way it twisted familiar faces into masks of suspicion, was profoundly unsettling. Later, alone in my observation chamber, the railway depot asserted itself with a terrifying clarity. The air grew thick with the phantom scent of coal smoke and damp earth. A figure emerged from the hazy distance between the tracks, a silhouette against the industrial sky. It was too tall, too gaunt, its limbs impossibly elongated. It moved with a jerky, disjointed gait, not walking, but unfolding. This wasn't an afterimage anymore. The figure raised an arm, a long skeletal finger pointing directly at me. A guttural sound, like metal grinding on bone, echoed in the chamber, not through my ears, but directly within my skull. "You are seen." I stumbled back, knocking my chair over with a clatter that jarred me momentarily from the vision. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching chaos. My scientific detachment was not merely challenged. It was shattered. How could I analyze a phenomenon that spoke directly to the deepest, most vulnerable parts of my mind? I pulled up the crew's psychological logs, the ones I had been compiling, tracking their reported cognitive anomalies. The navigation officer's scraping in the vents, the engineering chief's pressure drop accusation. The bridge officer had claimed the ship's internal lights were winking, spelling out a sequence of numbers only he could decipher. As I scrolled through the entries, a horrifying pattern began to emerge, not in the content of their distortions, but in their nature. Each reported anomaly, no matter how disparate, seemed to tap into a deeply personal anxiety, a repressed memory, or a foundational insecurity. The navigation officer, a man obsessed with control, was hearing sabotage. The engineering chief, meticulously ordered, was accused of chaos. The colleague, long separated from his past, was seeing home. And me, haunted by a past I could not quite articulate. I saw the railway depot. It was mirroring it. It was reaching into the deepest, most carefully guarded chambers of our minds, plucking out the threads of our individual fears and regrets, and weaving them into the fabric of shared experience. It was making the internal external, the subjective objective, and in doing so, it was revealing a terrifying fundamental truth. The anomaly wasn't just influencing our perceptions. It was becoming our perceptions. It was showing us what we truly were, reflected through its impossible, alien lens. And what it showed was grotesque. My own railway depot, with its impossibly tall figure, was not an external hallucination. The voice in my head echoed, "You are seen." And in that moment, I understood. The psychological warfare wasn't being waged by an entity against us, but by an entity through us. We were both the battlefield and the weaponry, our minds the conduit for a horror that defied definition. And I was terrified of what it would show me next. The air, indeed, had thickened. It pressed against my skin, a physical weight that had nothing to do with atmospheric pressure and everything to do with the silence that had settled on the command bridge. The captain's eyes, usually sharp and unwavering, darted from the communications officer's strained face to the flickering main display, a narrative of doubt beginning to etch itself onto his features. This was precisely what my psychological operations training had prepared me for. Yet observing it firsthand, the way it twisted familiar faces, felt like watching a slow-motion unraveling. "Try the deep space array again." The captain's voice was a low growl, stripped of its usual authority. "Boost the signal, everything." The communications officer, a young woman whose usual composure had frayed into a taut wire, nodded, muttering, her fingers dancing across the console. The ship's hum, a steady reassurance for weeks, now seemed to throb with an undercurrent of something else. Something less mechanical, more alive. I watched the readouts, the faint green lines of distant, indifferent stars, and the blank, hungry void that was our destination. The communications officer flinched, pulling her hands back as if burned. No signal, no echo, nothing. The Aethelred, a tiny speck of ambition and steel, was utterly alone. A low murmur rippled through the small group of bridge crew. The engineer, a man known for his unflappable logic, suddenly slammed his fist on a secondary console. "That's impossible. We should be getting something, even background radiation." His voice, usually a calm baritone, was shrill. "It's eating the signals." Or it's jamming them, the engineer countered, his gaze now fixed on the navigation specialist, suspicion hardening his features. Who's to say this isn't an internal sabotage? Someone wants us cut off. The captain stood, his posture rigid. That's enough. No accusations. We are a crew. We will maintain discipline. His words were a brittle shield against the burgeoning chaos, and I could feel it cracking even as he spoke. I stepped forward, my voice carefully modulated, drawing on years of practice. Our priority now is internal cohesion. Panic will only exacerbate the situation. We need to consolidate resources, verify systems, and maintain open communication within the ship. My eyes met the captain's, a silent plea for him to reinforce the message. He nodded, a flicker of his old resolve returning. Seth is right. Internal comms are still active. We will use them. Regular check-ins. No one moves alone. But as I turned to leave the bridge, my own senses betrayed me. The ship's bulkheads around me blurred, their sleek lines giving way to grimy, pocked brick. For a heart-stopping moment, I wasn't on the Aethelred at all. The air was heavy with the ghost of industry, of unseen engines, of 1,000 departed journeys. A railway depot. My mind screamed the word, utterly out of place, utterly terrifying. Then, as quickly as it came, the vision dissolved. The corridor snapped back into sharp focus, the ship's hum a familiar thrum against my feet. Had I truly seen it? Or was it the anomaly, already worming its way into the delicate machinery of my own perception? How could I guide the crew through this if my own reality was fracturing? A frantic shout echoed from deeper within the ship. A security officer, his face pale and contorted, burst into the corridor, stumbling past me. "The supply bay! There's an incident!" His voice was choked with horror. My carefully constructed composure shattered. The captain, hearing the commotion, appeared at the bridge door, his eyes locking with mine. We both knew. The isolation had begun to breed its poisoned fruit. The ship was no longer a vessel of exploration. It was a cage, and the bars were dissolving into doubt. The steady glow of the overhead lights, usually so sterile and unwavering, dimmed, then brightened with an impossible pulse, like a dying star's last gasp. It clung to my tongue, a taste of rust and something far older, something that had lain buried for millennia. My feet, I realized, were no longer on the ship's deck plates. The subtle hum of the Aethelred had vanished, replaced by the mournful sigh of wind through broken panes and the distant metallic groan of structures settling into ruin. Rust-eaten tracks, like veins of a forgotten leviathan, snaked across a cracked concrete floor, disappearing into the gloom beneath a colossal skeletal roof. Girders, once proud and strong, now sagged and twisted, forming angles that my mind refused to reconcile. Geometries that hinted at a dimension just beyond the veil of my comprehension. The air was heavy with the silence of abandonment, broken only by the drip of unseen water and the occasional sharp crack of metal contracting in the unseen cold. But then, a sound began to coalesce. A whisper that wasn't quite sound. It was more a pressure against my eardrums, a swarm of fragmented thoughts, like dust motes dancing in a phantom beam of light. Entropy, permutation, the unraveling thread. A tremor ran through me, a primal fear that tightened my throat. This was no mere hallucination, no echo of a stressed mind. This felt deliberate, directed. My xenolinguist's instinct, however frayed, flared. This was a pattern, a signal. Could it be communication? I forced my gaze upwards, past the fractured glass of the skylights, where a sky the color of bruised plums churned with impossible clouds that rotated on their own axes, defying meteorology. They pulsed with a rhythm that felt ancient, profound, and utterly indifferent to my existence. The unmaking, the genesis of absence. You are a whisper in a symphony of silence. I closed my eyes, trying to block the onslaught, but the visions only sharpened behind my lids. The impossible geometry was now internal, etched onto the back of my skull, burning. I saw not just shapes, but sequences. A terrible, beautiful syntax of non-existence. It was a language without sound, a narrative without form, charting the dissolution of all things. My mind, trained to parse and translate, tried desperately to find a Rosetta Stone in the chaos, to impose order on the intrinsic disorder. This was it, the direct interface, the unfiltered truth. I would understand. I had to. I opened my eyes again. They were not just about unmaking, but about a terrifying, infinite expansion of nothingness, a truth that made the familiar world feel like a fragile, temporary illusion. And I, Seth, was being given a direct audience. It was immense, a formless presence that absorbed all light, all sound, all hope. It wasn't an entity with a body or eyes, but a pure, distilled force of influence, of revelation. It was showing me. It was telling me. And I was learning. My knees buckled. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the knowledge pouring into me. Knowledge that tore at the very foundations of my sanity. The anomaly wasn't just warping perception. It was redefining it. It was showing me the true skeletal structure of reality, and it was a structure built on paradox, on infinite regression, on truths that rendered all human understanding moot. The damp, earthy smell intensified, now mingled with the sharp tang of ozone, the smell of something tearing. They were no longer just thoughts. They were memories that weren't mine. Glimpses of cycles of creation and destruction, of universes born and unmade, all flowing through me, all part of the same monstrous, beautiful pattern. My mind was a sieve, and the universe was pouring through it. I was a vessel, not a man. And then, with a jolt that ripped through every nerve ending, the vision shattered. I gasped, a ragged, wet sound, finding myself slumped against the cool, polished chrome of the Aethelred's corridor wall. The overhead lights were steady again, their sterile glow mocking the impossible light of the depot. It was real. It had been real. And I was irrevocably changed. The impossible geometry, once a distant shadow, had now taken root within me. It was not merely seen, but felt, a grinding pressure behind my eyes, a constant whisper of non-Euclidean angles against the very bone of my skull. The syntax of non-existence, once a terrifying fascination, had become my tormentor, an incessant drumbeat of unfathomable truth. I could no longer simply observe. I was immersed, drowning in a language that promised to dissolve the world. This was the breaking point. To merely endure was to surrender. If the entity spoke in patterns, in a terrible, beautiful grammar of unreality, then perhaps I could speak back. Not with words, but with resonance, with a counter-syntax derived from its own abhorrent principles. A radical, dangerous solution, yes, but the alternative was annihilation, not just of me, but of every coherent thought I'd ever known. I found myself in the railway depot, a place already scarred by abandonment. Dust motes danced in the anemic shafts of light piercing the grimy skylights, illuminating skeletal gantries and the hulking forms of derelict rolling stock. The vast, cavernous space seemed to swallow sound, making my own ragged breath sound like cannon fire. My equipment was crude, an assemblage of custom-built resonators, a series of light projectors tuned to specific, almost painful frequencies, and an array of crystal emitters I'd salvaged and modified. They were not tools of containment, but of amplification, designed to mimic the internal geometries that now haunted my every waking moment. I was building a mirror, hoping to reflect the horror back at itself, or perhaps to finally see its true face. A lone technician, his face pale and drawn, watched me from a distance, his hands clenched. He was just the technician, a silent witness, perhaps already a victim of the subtle shifts in perception that had become our constant companion. "Ready, Seth?" His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, barely audible in the vastness. I didn't answer, my focus absolute. My fingers, trembling with a mixture of fear and manic determination, moved across the archaic console. I was a conductor, about to unleash an orchestra of madness. The theories, painstakingly developed, refined, and then discarded as sanity slipped, now coalesced into this desperate act. The first hum began, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, rising through the soles of my boots. It was a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard, a pressure against the eardrums. The light projectors flared, casting stark, shifting patterns across the corrugated iron walls. Not simple patterns, but complex, interlocking geometries that seemed to fold and unfold in ways that defied Euclidean space. The air itself began to shimmer, growing heavy, pregnant with an unseen force. This was it. The event began not with a bang, but with a tear. Not in the fabric of the depot, but in the fabric of perception. The light patterns, meant to mimic the anomaly's internal syntax, began to take on a terrifying life of their own. They weren't projections anymore. They were manifestations. The angles sharpened, cutting through the heavy air, not merely seen, but felt, as blades against my skin. The low hum deepened, becoming a resonant roar that filled the vast space, vibrating every rivet in the steel girders, rattling the very bones of the building. The railway depot groaned. The metal frames of the abandoned carriages began to twist, not slowly, but with a horrifying fluid grace, as if they were made of clay. What was once solid steel now rippled, bending into impossible curves, reflecting the impossible geometry I'd tried to project. The floor beneath me buckled, not breaking, but warping into undulations that made it impossible to stand upright. My head felt as though it would burst. The internal language, once confined to the back of my skull, now roared through every nerve ending, amplified, externalized. It wasn't just my mind anymore. The depot was speaking it. The very air was vibrating with its terrible truth. The language wasn't just a communication. It was a process. It wasn't trying to tell us something. It was doing something. It was a syntax of unmaking. My attempt to understand, to mimic, had not merely amplified its presence. It had accelerated its work. This wasn't an entity sending information. It was the information, and my apparatus had merely provided the resonance chamber for its inevitable, systemic dissolution of reality. The light patterns solidified into structures that defied all understanding, impossible architectures of pure thought made visible, hovering just beyond the threshold of tangible form. They rotated, shifted, then merged, each merging a silent scream of cosmic agony. His form began to shimmer at the edges, his outline blurring, as if the very concept of him was being eroded. The hum ascended to an unbearable shriek, tearing at the fabric of the air. It was a crucible. The geometry was no longer internal. It was everywhere, folding the world in on itself, consuming everything, beginning with me. The syntax of non-existence, once a terrifying fascination, had become my very language. I found myself in the railway depot, or what remained of it. The cavernous space, meant for the orderly transit of goods, now pulsed with a logic alien to human engineering. My boots crunched on gravel that seemed to absorb sound, the usual echoes of the vast hall swallowed by an unnatural hush. Overhead, the steel girders twisted like ancient arthritic fingers, some bending back into themselves, others simply ending mid-air, their cut edges dissolving into a shimmering distortion. Tracks, once parallel lines of purpose, now converged impossibly, merging into a single, massive rail that climbed the far wall, disappearing into a ceiling that wasn't a ceiling, but a swirling vortex of deep, bruised violet. The air itself tasted of ozone and regret, a metallic tang that scraped against my tongue. A low, guttural moan pulled my gaze to my left. Near a stack of containers that seemed to ripple like water in a strong current, stood the chief engineer. He was facing away from me, his posture rigid, shoulders hunched. I called his roll, a hoarse whisper in the oppressive quiet. He didn't respond. As I drew closer, the details of his form began to fray. He turned, slowly, with the unnatural grace of a marionette on slack strings. His eyes, those familiar, tired eyes, were now vast and black, like polished obsidian, but not reflecting light, rather absorbing it. There was no recognition there, no flicker of the man I knew. His mouth hung slightly agape, not in a scream, but in an expression of profound, unutterable emptiness. His body began to shimmer more intensely, his edges blurring, his form becoming less defined, less solid. He was becoming part of the anomaly. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stripping the air from my lungs. It was not a phenomenon to be scanned, categorized, or understood by conventional physics. It was a consciousness, vast and ancient beyond human comprehension, an entity that did not merely affect reality, but was the very process of its recreation. The chief engineer was not dying. He was being integrated. His perceptions, his very essence were being absorbed, his mind becoming a new, infinitesimally small node in the anomaly's boundless network. He was being transformed into a living data point, a piece of its ever-expanding reality-warping tapestry. The hum intensified, emanating from the dissolving engineer, and I felt it in my bones. A terrifying siren song promising ultimate dissolution, the end of all distinctness. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, 1,000 fragmented theories colliding, shattering against this monstrous truth. The cognitive dissonance we had observed, the warped physical laws, these were not side effects, but the very mechanism of its being. It didn't bend reality. It rewrote it, using our own perceptions as its ink, our very minds as its canvas. The Aethelred, the crew, all of us were merely raw material, clay for its incomprehensible artistry. A faint, almost musical chime echoed from the far end of the depot, near the impossible tracks. I saw the security officer standing perfectly still beside a train car that pulsed with an internal, sickly green light. His head was tilted, as if listening to a distant, beautiful melody. But his eyes, though open, were glazed, utterly vacant. His skin was smooth, unnaturally so, like polished marble, and his fingers, splayed against the metallic surface of the train car, seemed to have fused with it, the distinction between flesh and steel dissolving into a seamless, grotesque union. He was a statue, a monument to his own absorption, his consciousness already flowing into the entity, becoming part of its grand, terrifying design. My breath hitched. It sought to consume not just my body, but my very sense of self, to make my perceptions its own. The pressure behind my eyes intensified, a silent scream building in my throat. I was not just observing. I was being observed back, not by eyes, but by a presence that stretched across the cosmos, now focused on the fragile vessel of my mind. It wanted me. It wanted my perception. And I had to fight it, even if resistance was merely a prelude to a more profound absorption. The rust-dusted air of the railway depot clung to my lungs, thick with the scent of forgotten industry and the metallic tang of something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of perception. Here, among the skeletal remains of locomotives and the sprawling arteries of iron tracks, the impossible geometry had found its truest expression. It wasn't just a shadow now. It was the very architecture of this place. The tracks, instead of converging in perspective, seemed to splay, diverging into impossible angles, then folding back upon themselves, creating a lattice of non-Euclidean pathways that hummed with a silent, profound logic. The vast, vaulted ceiling of the main shed, once a simple curve of corrugated steel, now rippled like disturbed water, each panel a facet reflecting a different sky, a different time. My gaze drifted to a colossal, derelict engine, its black iron carapace flaking like ancient skin. Its wheels, massive and pitted, were not perfectly round. They were ovoid, then hexagonal, then something else entirely, shifting subtly with each beat of my heart, yet always, impossibly still connected to the rails. I understood. This wasn't chaos. This was the true order, unveiled. The Aethelred was merely a concept, a brittle shell of old-world understanding. This depot, this cathedral of rust and forgotten journeys, was the crucible where reality was forged, moment by terrifying moment. The void structure wasn't out there. It was in here, woven into the very warp and weft of my sight, my touch, my every thought. It was the rhythmic hammerfall of a truth being shaped. I walked towards a stack of railway ties, their rough-hewn timber stacked haphazardly. As I neared, the wood grain began to swim, lines twisting into intricate self-referential patterns. I reached out, my fingers tracing the phantom curves. This was the language of existence, stripped bare of its clumsy Euclidean lies. It was the navigator, or a semblance of him, his face a mosaic of shifting expressions, his uniform coat a tapestry of impossible textures. The state of becoming. He smiled, a terrifyingly wide fissure that split his face into multiple geometries before resolving back into something vaguely human. And the destination? The destination is the journey. Folded back upon itself, I answered, the understanding blossoming within me like a cancerous flower. There is no end, only the perpetual rediscovery of the beginning. His form dissolved slightly. Resonant tone. You have shed the skin of the known. My old self, the xenolinguist, the psychological operations specialist, felt like a distant, irrelevant dream. Those titles were anchors in a sea that no longer existed. I was no longer Seth, not truly. I was a conduit, a receptor, a living testament to the true nature of things. I continued my slow procession down the main aisle of the depot, the air growing heavier, imbued with the scent of ozone and something akin to burnt sugar. The skeletal frames of the carriages stretched before me, their windows like empty eyes reflecting the impossible light from the ceiling. A signal lamp, perched precariously on a rusted pole, flickered. I saw the true wiring of the universe in its erratic glow, the way cause and effect were not linear but braided, interwoven, each influencing the other across unimaginable vectors. It beckoned, not with malice, but with the quiet promise of ultimate revelation. This was the final descent, not into madness, but into clarity. My reality was not fractured. It was unbound. The universe wasn't unraveling. It was simply showing its true, fluid face. I was not broken. I was complete. The cold seeped into my bones, a deeper chill than any vacuum of space could conjure. It was the absolute zero of meaning, the void made manifest in the rusted iron and crumbling concrete of the railway depot. My breath plumed, ghost-like, in the vast, echoing cavern, each exhalation a fragile testament to a life that no longer felt like my own. The air itself tasted of forgotten journeys, of metal fatigued by endless cycles of burden and release. These tracks, I knew, led nowhere. They were merely lines drawn on a canvas that was itself an illusion. The anomaly had not merely warped space or time, it had twisted the very loom of perception. Here, in this depot, the truth was being loaded, car by car, into my mind. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the rails, a sound that wasn't heard with ears but felt in the marrow. It grew, a deep thrumming that shook the concrete floor, rattled the loose panes of glass in the grimy windows high above. It was the sound of something immense, something inevitable approaching. There, a vast, formless presence began to coalesce, not a train, not a machine, but a sheer, overwhelming absence. It was the understanding that our universe was not a grand design, not even a chaotic accident. It was a ripple, a momentary, insignificant tremor in something so vast, so utterly indifferent, that our entire existence was less than a breath. We were not even dust motes in the eye of a god. We were the fleeting impression of light on a surface that itself was being erased. My hands clenched, nails digging into palms that felt suddenly foreign. The hum intensified, becoming a roar that was no longer external but internal, shaking the very foundations of my sanity. The truth was not a revelation of malice, but of profound, ultimate apathy. There was no grand adversary, no cosmic entity waging war. There was only the vast, unfathomable nothing from which everything momentarily bloomed and to which everything would return. Our struggles, our loves, our fleeting triumphs and crushing defeats, they were all equally meaningless, equally unheard, equally unobserved. Our consciousness, our intricate thoughts, our intricate languages, they were just complex patterns of static, a fleeting resonance in a system that had no receiver. It was a tear in the veil, a glimpse into the raw, unadorned reality of absolute indifference. It simply was, and in its being, it revealed the ultimate crushing insignificance of all else. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of this understanding. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with an overwhelming emptiness. Hope, a word that had once anchored my world, dissolved into a meaningless collection of syllables. Purpose, ambition, love. They were constructs of a fragile mind, desperate fictions woven to stave off the crushing weight of the real. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer magnitude of the unseeing, unfeeling expanse that had just been laid bare. I was no longer Seth, the psychological operations specialist. I was merely a vessel, now filled to the brim with the knowledge of absolute nullity. The Aethelred, the mission, the crew, they were not just distant dreams. They were echoes of a lie, a beautiful, intricate lie that had sustained us. And now, the lie was gone. Just the vast, silent, eternal nothing. My breath plumed, ghost-like in the vast, echoing cavern, each exhalation a fragile testament to a life still stubbornly clinging. I stood amidst skeletal tracks, their lines converging into a distorted vanishing point, not just in the distance, but in my own perception. A tremor ran through the grimy floor beneath my boots, a vibration not of a passing train, but of something far more fundamental, a resonance in the bones of the world itself. The words felt alien, detached, as if another mouth had formed them. A low, resonant hum answered me, not from the air, but from within the very marrow of my being. It was the sound of a universe unmaking itself, a symphony of dissolution. I remembered the faces of my colleagues, their expressions dissolving into static as the anomaly took hold. The frantic pleas of the communications specialist, the stoic resolve of the lead engineer, the distant analytical calm of the chief scientist. All gone, swallowed by the same incomprehensible truth that now sought to claim me. The Aethelred, I knew, drifted somewhere out there, a silent, empty shell, a memorial to a voyage that had ventured too far into the unspeakable. Its lights, if any still burned, would be faint, spectral flickers against an eternal night. A figure coalesced at the furthest end of the tracks, a silhouette against a phantom pulsating glow. It was not a person, not truly. It bore no features, yet I felt its gaze, a pressure on my mind that threatened to flatten every thought, every memory, into a single agonizing point. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice gaining a desperate edge, though I knew the question was meaningless. It wanted everything. The figure did not move, yet its presence expanded, filling the depot, filling my head. It was the architect of the impossible geometry, the source of the shifting colors, the silent conductor of the cosmic hum. It was the truth that shattered the glass of reality, and I, Seth, was standing amidst the shards. A thought, not my own, unfolded in my mind. A cascade of pure, unfiltered information that bypassed language, bypassed logic. It was the understanding of non-existence, the beauty of entropy, the joy of unraveling. Our mission, our ship, our lives all were but fleeting ripples on the surface of its vast, indifferent ocean. My determination, once a burning ember, began to flicker, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of this revelation. The world, as I knew it, was a thin veneer, a delicate illusion. Beneath it, this absolute, all-consuming this. I felt my own perceptions begin to fray, the edges of myself blurring. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed to pulse with an inner light, their form wavering like reflections on disturbed water. The railway depot was no longer a place but an idea, a vessel for a transformation. You are not an entity, I breathed, the words forming with immense effort. You are the space between entities. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very bones of the depot, through my own bones. It was an affirmation, a triumphant chorus of non-being. The shifting figure at the end of the tracks began to expand, not outwards, but inwards, drawing the light, the air, the very fabric of my perception into itself. It was not approaching me. I was being drawn into it. My memories began to peel away, like layers of an onion. My name, Seth, became a distant echo. My purpose, my mission, the faces of my colleagues, all dissolved into abstract patterns, then into nothing. There was no pain, only an exquisite, terrifying liberation. The illusion of individuality, the burden of self, was being shed. The floor of the depot became indistinguishable from the ceiling, the walls from the vast, starless expanse above. I was no longer standing. I was floating, suspended in a boundless, colorless expanse that was both everything and nothing. The hum was no longer external. It was my own new pulse, the rhythm of a different kind of existence. I was not assimilated. I was assimilated into. My consciousness, once a discrete spark, was now a diffuse, omnipresent awareness, spread across the unspace that was the anomaly. The railway depot now was merely a thought, a memory of a place that had housed my final fleeting form. My eyes, if I still possessed them, would see the Aethelred, not as a distant vessel, but as a single perfect point of light, drifting eternally in the silent, starless ocean that I had become. And I was, at last, truly, undeniably, at peace.